thanks for coming to Firaxicon. I hope you're all having a great time, and you got to play our game a little bit. And thanks for coming to our talk. This talk is about the great mistake. We thought that for those of you who are like such big fans of Firaxis that you actually came to Firaxicon, we would tell you what we told nobody else, which is what we actually sort of wrote down might have actually happened during the great mistake that sets up the game. Now, it's important before we talk about any of this that we made a very deliberate decision not to write this into the game and not to say in any interviews up until now what happened. And that's because we think it's just sort of more fun for everyone who plays if you get to sort of imagine for yourself what could have happened. Like, where would these factions have come from? Why would we have gone into space? What really is going on Earth while you're playing your game on the new planet? What do you go back and find when you're doing one of the Promised Land or the Emancipation Victory? So even though we're going to tell you what we thought, you don't have to believe it. You can overwrite it if you want.
Yeah, it's not, what you're about to hear now is not canon by any means. That means you too, Internet, not canon.
Right. So these were what we did this for kind of two reasons. One was because it was fun to like take the current map of the world and like kick it over and do stuff, but also because we wanted to set up the factions, the 8 factions that are in the game. And it was important that we tell ourselves a little bit of backstory for where they come from, because that was going to inform everything about their design and their art and their voice acting and all of that stuff. Like we say, you know, like I know that you, in a lot of interviews, you've made reference to things like how Suzanne Fielding of ARC speaks English and Spanish, and
yeah, Kozlov is Polish and Russian. I mean, this is cribbed straight from Joss Whedon here, Firefly, right? How much does it say in Firefly when they curse in Chinese about what happened on Earth without there ever having to be any exposition to explain that? And that's the kind of thing we were trying to create, and we wanted to present a very multicultural future, one that's optimistic in that way, that is these cultures blended and are celebrated in their own way, and they're different but similar to what we know.
And for that to be like, you know, believable to the players, we did actually have to put some stuff on paper to guide ourselves. I mean, there's a lot more content that goes into making a game that the player will ever see. That's sort of, it's like study notes for the designer. Like, you do it for your own benefit or for the benefit of the team or other people who are going to work on it. So that, you know, we all like check and balance each other. Like, you know, oh, the Franco-Iberians came from here, and so like the artist's work is like, no, they came from here, not there. Remember, see, we've got it written down. So it's for all that stuff. So this was a timeline that we made.
A couple things before we go into an explanation of this exactly. There were 2 kind of guiding principles behind this. One was that at the end of the day, even though all of this terrible stuff happens on Earth, at the end of the day, when the game begins, it starts from a point of optimism. Civilization is a very optimistic and aspirational product, and we wanted to keep that in our fiction. So it's not a dystopia. It's Earth having clawed its way back from disaster in order to send people into space. So that was important. And the second thing is that it was simple, because again, we allude to the things in this timeline in the game, the great mistake, the seeding, and all that. But we wanted the player to fill in their own information about what actually happened.
Right. And like the whole dystopia thing, like the great mistake is obviously a catastrophe. In fact, it's multiple catastrophes. And it was sort of fun for us to do that, but it's also necessary, like, once again, like out of great trial comes great achievement sort of thing. So like, what the seeding and leaving Earth for a new planet represents the first step in or a step in the midst of sort of a general human resurgence and sort of a Star Trek future where we are knitting ourselves back together to go about among the stars and so on.
So the thing starts about 50 years from now, and there's this event called the Great Mistake, and we're going to go into the details of what exactly that was in a minute. That's kind of the bulk of what Dave's talking about when we're saying we wrote all this stuff on the whiteboard. Mm-hmm. It's this cascade of events that kicks off the whole thing. Then some indeterminate number of years pass. 4 generations is what we wrote on the whiteboard. And this was kind of important because we didn't want to put an exact date on this. We wanted to build in some ambiguity here, again, so that, well, really so that we didn't have to explain it ourselves.
our own little back door.
Yeah, right. So there's a little bit of like wiggle room there. Mm-hmm. So 4 generations pass, and then the nations get to this point where they're able to construct the infrastructure once again to send people to space. there's simultaneous discoveries of technology that will facilitate deep space exploration and travel, and the discovery of this thing called the inflection point. And this is something we don't really talk a whole lot about in the game's fiction or at all, but this was an important point for us internally. The inflection point is kind of this mathematical analysis of the society and resource distribution and economic situation on the planet that determines that after a certain point, humanity will no longer be able to lift things of consequence out of orbit. So we can't, there will be a point where we run out of fuel, basically. We run out of titanium, we run out of the infrastructure, the ability to do this. And this realization, coupled with advances in technology that allow for deep space exploration, are what kicks off the seeding. And the seeding is basically where the game begins. It's where the seeded start is. It's where you're selecting, you're putting together your expedition and launching a spacecraft. So that kind of takes you all the way up to the front of the game.
Yeah, I mean, the inflection point was a really cool idea. It was really you.
It was Anton, I think.
No,
was it me?
There's no Anton.
I'll take
It's
credit.
just you.
I mean, okay, fine.
Yeah, I remember you all about the inflection point because you're the greater devotee of like actual spaceflight technology than I am, and you were saying like after the inflection point is reached, which is a mathematical certainty even today. This isn't made up. Like there is a finite quantity of cubic centimeters of oil on the Earth that we could make into rocket fuel. So someday we will reach this point. After that, anybody who's on Earth is there for good. Like that's it. Unless we by that point had already colonized another planet that has a new store. So it's interesting to note that like we probably could have gotten the game going with just that, right? We could have just said, all right, at some point we figure out we got to get out of here or the door is going to shut on us, so we go. But we coupled it with the great mistake on the other side because that alone is not enough. It's not like we're being kind of philosophical about this and saying just figuring out that we could go into space isn't really enough to like start this game with a bang. Like the great mistake and the troubles and the sort of general upsurge that comes from it was necessary too.
This is kind of on a very large scale what happened with the space race, right? We're big fans of space exploration history, and it took the Cold War to send us to the moon. So what would be even worse than that?
That's why we haven't really gone back.
Right.
Notice, I don't know, we don't care enough perhaps today. We could, but rather have an iPhone? I don't know. That's what we seem to care about. And then another interesting thing about this timeline is that there's no time given between inflection point reached and game begins. Because once again, we're suggesting that like maybe the planet that you're going to and the spacecraft you're traveling on, who knows how long that could take. It could have been a generation ship, could be a cryo ship, could be some other kind of hyper-fast ship that gets there fairly quickly. So that was another important, like, we don't know how much time. Because what that does is let the events of Earth continue to unfold in an unknown way. Like by the time you land on the planet, who knows what's going on back on Earth? You could have been in space for 500 years. That planet could be totally gone by now. Or you could have been in space for 25 years and things are basically as you left them.
And it also, again, covers our asses because we don't have to explain propulsion or faster than light.
Yeah, even though we did. We had our writer like write up all the ways that we could travel at near light speed. And we're like, oh, these are really cool. We're not going to use any of this in the game, but thanks. All right, so once again, so like when this is one of the very first things that we did in the design of Beyond Earth was conceive the great mistake. And these were sort of like the big ideas floating around the room. Like, what does a great mistake need to do? The things that make up the great mistake got to do these things. So they got to shake up the maps of the world, like the borders and the alliances. All that's got to get squiggled around. So what's a good way of doing that? Well, war and devastation. And then ecological catastrophe. It's very plausible, it's very topical, it's kind of hip about the whole sea levels rising and everything. Nations kind of forced into new resource crises or having like extremely valuable pieces of their territory removed because they're underwater. These will force confrontation, confrontation change in the maps of the world. And then population upheaval sort of comes alongside that, If like 3/4 of India floods because it's so low lying, well, that changes the map, but it also forces the people who live there to go somewhere else. And that represents a crisis for all the nations that neighbor India or that have common commerce with India. And so all of the sort of cultural regions of the world, places where cultures have grown up relatively in isolation or in purity, suddenly get blended. Massive quantities of people who never really had to deal with each other before now deal with each other a lot. And then, going along with the ecological catastrophe, crises of resources, famine, pestilence, so like pandemics, food generation problems, these would also force populations to move or to die off, to like suffer a lot. And then you want to talk about the tech appeal?
Technology, it was important that like a lot of time passes in this timeline we just showed you a minute ago. And we didn't want the game to start in this super futuristic place, even though perhaps 400 years have passed since the Great Mistake happened. Because we want the player to make that progression themselves. We want the player to start from basically what we have today plus 50 years and then move into the future in the game, not in the backstory of the game. So we wanted to figure out a way for us to have our cake and eat it too, I guess. And our idea there was that after the Great Mistake and after this humanitarian crisis and these movement of peoples and the sea level rise and all of this stuff, the nations sort of lose communication with each other, and there's some loss of information. Like no one really knows what the Great Mistake was by the time you, the player, start the game, because history wasn't really recorded in this period of turmoil.
Fractured
or it's fractured. It's sort of more myth.
It's a multi-generation game of telephone.
Yeah, exactly. So if you can imagine what would happen if the internet goes away, that's kind of what we imply.
People forget what cats are.
Right. More cats. So that kind of served a purpose too. Again, it served a gameplay purpose for us. We wanted to set the stage with a mix of technologies. We kind of referenced like District 9. There's some maybe even a little bit earlier than that, like some robotics, some higher order computer technologies. Obviously, we can travel in deep space, but there's still a lot more that the player gets to do in the game itself.
Yeah, right. So it's like the global progress kind of grinds to a halt, and maybe even rewinds a little bit, and then has to start again and catch back up, and then it's off and running by the time. We do suggest that by the time the inflection point is reached, we're basically back to where we are today plus a little. Things are more or less in control again. All right, so I'm putting this up. This one is really interesting. This was put on Reddit by a fan of the game. And I will remind you, the game hasn't come out yet. Where he or she postulated what the regions of the world would be as members of the 8 factions in the game. And I don't know where he got his information from. I think just fluff that we had released up until that point. But we put it up here because, as you'll discover, he was very close. He was eerily close.
Yeah.
We were like, wow, how did he know that? So you can't really read the legend, but you can probably recognize the colors for the 8 factions. If it has a hash lines, that means disputed, meaning I guess he's not confident that that's part of the faction. And then white is completely unknown. It's never mentioned in any of the stories. We don't know who they might have gone with, if anyone. Maybe they're not represented at all. So a couple regions to highlight really quick that you should put a bookmark in your mind is the United Kingdom and Scandinavia are not represented, nor is the Middle East. So we'll come back to that. So now we're when we actually did this, we literally sat in the office and stood at the whiteboard, and I just kind of looked at it for a little bit. And then I started writing things that were headlines, headline news, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens.
I'm sitting in my chair yelling.
Right, we're doing this.
This is how we work.
We're going down.
Dave writes, I yell.
So we recorded all of that in our design documents, one of the earliest pieces of design in the game. And we're going to go through it in a little, Ken Burns style. So, step 1. A nuclear event occurs in the Chinese industrial city of Chengdu. This detonation is a weak device, later proven to be a suitcase or dirty bomb, one with enough force to severely damage the city and cause widespread casualties. So, we start the Great Mistake in China, which is interesting because recall we're extrapolating from current geopolitics. And there's probably a lot of expectation that if there's going to be a problem, a big explosion or something like that, people are kind of expecting it to be in the US or in Europe, someplace that is sort of on the top of the hot list for countries to hate right now. But let us not forget that China is rapidly becoming the dominant economy and dominant culture in the world, population-wise. And so we imagine, well, let's say maybe 50 years from now they have been. And we also know that already China is sort of taking a very aggressive stance to some developing areas of the globe in the search for resources. So exactly the same things that the US has done to attract attention up until now, China is doing and will be doing a lot more of. So we say, all right, well, let's suppose that China was the one shoving over local governments and stealing resources from resource-rich places. And they're the ones that are attracting negative attention at the time of the Great Mistake. So rather than the US, we say it starts in China. So shocked and reeling, the Chinese authority quickly blames radical factions linked to the ruling parties in Iran. Oh, the Middle East, always the culprit. We have more sophisticated reasons. A longtime rival for regional oil resources and the source of decades of worsening relations and rising tensions over control of Afghanistan. Convinced of Iran's culpability in the detonation, China launches a series of small tactical nuclear strikes against Iran's major cities and industrial commercial centers, and a ground invasion of the Iranian puppet government in Afghanistan. So we pretty much say China and Iran accelerate through a Cold War in about 5 hours and go straight to the nuclear exchange. Keep in mind also, current geopolitics, Iran and its nuclear enrichment is sort of a hot topic right now. So 50 years from now, maybe Iran has a nuke or two, maybe they don't. Maybe there was good reason to suspect that they were behind a sort of limited detonation in China. So, part 3, Pakistan, bound by alliance and common interest to Iran, mobilizes its air power to support the Afghani resistance, striking the invading Chinese forces and their supply lines in western China. China resists with further tactical nuclear strikes against air bases and nuclear weapons depots in Pakistan. Pakistan, already a nuclear power, this is probably not going to end well. Sorry, that was the China hitting, oh, right, we're coming into this. So, with its air force and nuclear silos destroyed, Pakistan retaliates with the only option remaining, a hitherto unknown ballistic missile submarine on station near the Bering Strait. It launches a spectrum of medium-range nukes against several Chinese air bases and industrial centers. China responds with a full-scale nuclear salvo against populated areas in Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, and North Korea for good measure. Seeking to disarm or disable the nuclear capabilities of all of its continental neighbors. Only the appearance of NATO submarines in Chinese waters finally deters them from further nuclear strikes and halts the nuclear exchange. So, and then the last little map part. When the fallout finally settles, 1/3 of the world's population lives in a nation that has suffered a nuclear event. The Fertile Crescent has been decimated, its arable land irradiated, and its population and infrastructure thrown into chaos. A refugee crisis on an unprecedented scale ensues as the populations of the Middle East flee their shattered homelands. The human tide pours into all neighboring regions. The economies of Eastern Europe and Russia stagger under the load, and their burden quickly begins to fracture the delicate Eurozone alliance. Simultaneously, the refugees flood Central and Saharan Africa, destabilizing many of the countries there and triggering a wave of civilian uprisings and military crackdowns as the besieged African governments attempt to maintain control. Eventually, a status quo is established, embroiling all global powers in a humanitarian crisis that exacts a massive drain on the world economy. And that's like the first third. So nuclear exchange, old favorite, right? Why a nuclear event? Well, first of all, it's easy, right? Remember those points, I can't go back that far, about how we want to upheave the territory and the populations. And warfare and devastation are the first two, right? The other advantage is that it's fast compared to climate change, relatively. So if we can start the thing off with sort of push the world to the brink with a couple of semi-plausible nuclear exchange and cause a giant, mess in the Asian continent, then the slow force of climate change can tip that over. And that together would probably be enough to wreck the world for 400 years. So, you want to read the rest? Keep going.
Story time with Dave. Where did we leave off here?
Worst bedtime story.
Right, worst bedtime story ever.
Never sleep again.
All right. Right here?
We're there.
Yes. As years pass and the Eurasian world struggles to maintain stability, it becomes evident that with the extensive damage and fallout from the nuclear war has inundated the planet's atmosphere with greenhouse gases. Polar melting accelerates by an order of magnitude. Within a decade, both poles are ice-free half the year, causing worldwide sea level change and the sea to rise by 20 feet or more. So, as Dave said, like now that we have irradiated countries, we needed another reason to displace and constrain.
Right. What about the other half of the world that's not
Right.
on this map?
So that's it. Sea
There you
level
go.
rise. There you go.
Yeah. No problem.
The biggest losers are coastal China, coastal India, the Americas, whose population displacement and property loss threaten to consume their already depressed economies. In desperation, the people of India muscle aside a century of resentment to find common ground with their neighbors, coalescing around a new religious revival, combining the best tenets of regional brands of Hinduism and Islam, with a charismatic guru leading the way into a new theocratic coalition government. Steel reeling from the Chinese bombardment, Pakistan becomes India's principal collaborator in this coalition. Not everyone in the region appreciates this turn of events, however, and the new coalition is not established without a handful of bloody partisan uprisings and brutally quelled rebellions. Mired in their own problems, the world's powers do nothing to intervene.
So this is probably one of the most audacious moves we made, was suggesting that India and Pakistan join up again. And it's pretty far-fetched given their history, but we were sort of suggesting that as the only other two nuclear powers in Asia, after China just like vomited nukes everywhere, that they've got now like a really good reason to help each other. You know, like the enemy of my enemy, and in the face of a common foe. Because while China suffered a fair bit nuclear-wise, they were the instigators in a lot of these, and there's a lot of reasons to suspect that they're going to be a little trigger-happy in the future, perhaps, on the nukes, and that they've got a lot more. And it's still an enormous country with a lot of power. So there's not any reason to think that China's like done. So India and Pakistan, suffering all of these problems, do have some common history together, and may be more likely to work together than any of the other Southern Asia subcontinent governments. That's at least what we suggest. So.
In the wake of the Chinese nuclear war, worldwide diplomatic relations deteriorate completely. Many nations, particularly the more wealthy, establish Western powers, wall themselves off behind a seal of isolationist policies and military deterrence. The world enters an uneasy Cold War, an information dark age where international commerce and cooperation effectively cease to exist, each nation or region turning inward to sort out its affairs as best it can. So again, this is the part where we need to figure out why technology doesn't progress over 400 years, or 4 generations, however long, before the game begins. So we can kind of, if you look at how the cycle of war, and catastrophe, there's sort of this isolationism is sort of a cyclical thing in our political landscape. So they go whole hog with this and wall themselves off from everybody else. Notable exceptions are Australia, whose willingness to cut deals with its Southeast Asian and islander neighbors forged the new Pacific Rim Alliance. With surprising power and influence, they become kind of the financial center, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Let's see. And Sub-Saharan Africa, whose nations find common ground in the face of the refugee crisis and forge the first ever African Union, a rising star fueled by the continent's rich mineral wealth and insulation from the rising seas. So they kind of become kind of the breadbasket, really, which is the irony there. They feed the world for the first time.
We did actually look at some projections for what might actually happen to the planet in climate change, not including a nuclear problem. And Africa as a continent suffers probably the least in terms of territory loss from rising sea levels, because it's very high lying. And as most people know, Africa is extremely resource dense. It's very rich. It's just been exploited forever by everybody else. So in the wake of the Great Mistake, when everyone's all of a sudden isolationist and not trying anymore, they suddenly have the room and the need to accelerate in a hurry into this new kind of union, and that's where the People's African Union comes from. So, at that point, we just let it go. We're like, okay, that's enough. That'll get things going. And so going back to this map that the fan made, you can see, not too bad. So China, pretty much on its own. Maybe it sucks up Mongolia along the way. And we're very careful about suggesting that Korea and Japan are part of the pack, part of the Asian, what is it called? Pan-Asian
Cooperative. Yeah.
Because Japan is sort of an interesting beast in this, because it's extremely wealthy and advanced, but is going to get really badly hit by climate change. And it's kind of right in the middle of all of this nuclear trouble. Like, they would have a lot of reason to be afraid of China without the US kind of getting their backs. And if the US stops getting their back, a la isolationism, their future is really uncertain. So this is where our friend would have gotten it wrong, and we would say that Japan should be white. It's something that we specifically don't say what happens to them. And kind of the same with South Korea. We assume that the two of them have more in common with each other than with China. I'd say Australia is pretty close. The Kavithans are pretty close. Africa is a little ambitious. It's not like the whole continent of Africa. But that part in the middle, below the desert probably, and South Africa. Franco-Iberia would still include probably more of the EU than you see there. We suggest that the EU pretty much falls apart right away. And right, but it's a lot of small countries with a lot of wealth and a lot of established sort of political interest. So like diplomacy there, like recovery there, we suggest happens quickest and fastest back to the presence, which is why they're the culture sieve. So Franco-Iberia was just a name. Really, it's kind of like the remnant / version 2 of the EU. But it's important that a lot of the other more wealthy nations in this that are white, like Germany and the Nordic countries. We want to be white because we don't want to suggest that they necessarily are part of Franco-Iberia or part of the Slavic Federation, because they've got a lot of history on their side as well, and their own story is worth telling on its own. We just haven't. Brasilia, once again, maybe a little ambitious. They probably don't own the entire continent, but Brazil on its own is probably enough. And then ARC, the Americans, we would probably include Mexico and Canada, just because. Because what are they gonna do? Mexican spaceships. No. What we suggest is that actually, I think ARC is probably one of the most interesting choices we made, because there's 8 factions. Yeah, here they are, and you could probably draw lines from 7 of them to the same ideas that were in Alpha Centauri, like their play style focus, and that was one of our goals with this whole process, was to set up these 8 factions with plausible origins to be play style focused. So wealth, technology, production, international cooperation and trade, growth and health, et cetera, culture. But there's 8, and the ARC is really the wild card. They are what you want them to be. They're about power, control, not necessarily domination by military means, but by whatever means.
One of their buffs is espionage. Mm-hmm. So you get a buff to covert ops when you pick ARC.
So they're very mercenary.
They're also one of the few that aren't a nation.
Right.
So the American Reclamation Corporation is ostensibly a corporation, right? But it's the idea of kind of the super PAC times 1,000. So they have so much wealth, there's an influence that they basically call the shots. The government of America, we suggest, is sort of, it's there, but doesn't have a whole lot to do. So yeah, in terms of gameplay, they really are a wild card, and they're kind of an interesting case in terms of the fiction as well.
Yeah, we're obviously Americans, so we felt comfortable being this cynical, I would say, about the future of America. And we obviously know a lot about current geopolitics in the U.S., so this reminds me a little bit of kind of like a V for Vendetta style idea. Like the guy who made Warren Ellis, who made V for Vendetta, did it during Margaret Thatcher's premiership, which was pretty scary to some liberal Brits during the time, and they're looking at this and imagining a future of totalitarian conservatism. They were obviously, it was hyperbolic, of course, but enough things were going on in the political scheme there that seemed like something that they could imagine. And so us today in the U.S. with like things like Citizens United and stuff like that, like power, money and power going together like they always have, we feel like this is a plausible thought. We could draw the line forward. And once again, it's interesting because we don't suggest necessarily that the U.S. government isn't also involved in the space race somehow. Just that by the time this happens, corporations have so much power that they can just do it on their own. They can stand alongside a nation. They've got that much power. And I think many of the Americans in the room would go along with us that that's possible. That could in fact happen. I mean, we're like maybe like stuff like SpaceX and so on is the white hat private space faring, and this doesn't necessarily, like, we're not sure what color hat they're wearing. I guess it's probably black. So, evil corporation, Exxon spaceships. Right. Okay. So this was the fictional backstory for these 8 factions. But once I mentioned just a little while ago that part of the goal was to set up their playstyles, because we knew from the beginning that we wanted the factions to be playstyle oriented. So there's some massaging of like this nebulous future, the time during the Great Mistake, the in-between time, this right here, the 4 generations, where they're obviously like evolving from just everybody wrecked at the end of the Great Mistake into what they're going to be when you start the game. And this is where like I think it's most fun for us to let just be in the mind of the player. Like we, the Australia and their combination with the Pacific Rim nations. We say they end up as like the bankers, the wealth and international cooperation guys, but we don't say how, or why. What was it about the combination of Australia and like Singapore that made that happen? Well, we don't really say. We didn't write down for ourselves. We just kind of let that unfold. At this point, we were falling back not really to like a story we were making up, but to who they really are. And even in the midst of all of the strife that we created for the Great Mistake, what we wanted at the end was factions that were celebratory, that were saying these are the best things about these cultures. Like people who are actually from Australia or from Brazil should look at like this faction that we've made up based on who they are and be proud of it and want to actually participate. And that was very tricky because it's not like history where you can be like, oh, well, Attila the Hun, he killed everybody, so well, what do you want? It's not up to me. Play it.
Tune into Ed's talk a little bit.
Right, yeah, a little bit later, taking civs. So like, yeah, like you can't change history. You could reinterpret it, but it was what it was. But in this, we're inventing it all, and we're doing more than that. We're doing it based on who people presently are and what they're presently doing, which people have a lot of opinions on and feel very involved in, as they should. So that's part of why we leave these big nebulous gaps in the story, even for ourselves, to shield ourselves. And that's also another reason why we never say this in the game, in the official game. That's why I'm only saying it to you and
the internet
and 100 million viewers. Right. But for everyone who just watched this and watched us just like wreck the planet and suggest that everything they know is wrong, this is just one way, maybe it could have happened. We really want you to just enjoy the backstory of planet Earth and the Great Mistake and say, I think it would have happened this way. That's why we went into space. Please, by all means, do that. The game is wide open for you to do. And I guess that's it. We can take some questions.
We're going to be here for a little while, so if you want to come talk to us, we'll be right there. But thanks for coming.
Yeah.